Hello everybody, my name is Jade, and this week I'm discussing Planetfall by Emma Newman. Now, I've never covered a book in just one episode before, so this is different from my regular formula. So at the beginning I'm going to do a spoiler-free section, and then you can duck out if you haven't read the book. Which you should, because the plot is pretty important in this one, so I do definitely recommend reading this without knowing anything going in other than what I'm about to share. So what is Planetfall? So Planetfall was a novel that was written by Emma Newman and published in 2015. And it comes out to about 320 pages, actually. It's exactly 320 pages, I just googled it. And it is a science fiction novel. It's the first in a series, but you don't have to continue reading past this book. It stands alone very well. And I haven't read the rest of the books in the series, but I do think that this stands alone just fine. I will check out the rest of the series for certain, because I was very impressed with this book, but I think that this is a novel that could have been published independently with no sequels or anything like that, and it would have been perfectly sensible. So, Planetfall is the story of Renata, a 3D printer engineer on a human colony on a planet far flung out into space. Renata has been living in this colony for 20 years, and she was part of the first and only wave to arrive there. The reason that Renata came to this colony is because she was following her best friend Sue, who was really the one who was not only extremely passionate about coming to this planet, but was the leader of the colony project, or they call her the Pathfinder. One of my favorite things about this book is the world building. A lot of the concepts that you see for colonies in space are very similar. You see a lot of shipping crates, you see a lot of metal. Renata's colony uses a lot of biological building materials. They grow their houses from algae and other biological materials. Their furniture is made by shaping the way plants grow. And Renata's job as a 3D printer engineer is not only to work with plastics and metals, but to work with biology. The book opens on her describing to someone else how she is putting research into 3D printing human organs. So the 3D printing in this universe is almost akin to the Star Trek food replicator. This is basically a post-scarcity society, but they do have to have certain resources. It's not just a planet of excess. People still have jobs and roles in the community, but they do have a significantly easier time with resources than, say, we do. But the creative atmosphere and concept behind this technology adds just a little bit of an air to the story that this author has gone the extra mile to tell something that is non-standard. It tells you that Emma Newman doesn't want to write Star Trek fanfiction, and she's not trying to make the next Expanse. She is telling a story that is different, and it's not gratuitously different. The colony technology still makes sense. You can still believe in a future where we develop in this direction, even if it's not the most popular interpretation. But it is different. But while the world concept in Planetfall is appealing, the real appeal of the story is the writing, specifically the narration of Renata. This is a story where information is doled out to you in an order that is very specific. This isn't the kind of story where you're going to open up page 1 and get an exposition dump. It is a story in which information is drip-fed to you, and each new piece of information recontextualizes what you knew up until this point. This is the best execution of this concept that I have ever seen. Information dumps in this story are either extremely minimal or extremely organic. The writing feels as if you are simply watching Renata's day, or however she is going about her job, exactly as she thinks of it. But at the end of it, you get a complete story. Nothing ever feels like it has been put here for your benefit, even though the distribution of information in this book is impeccably planned. Finally, this is a story that largely focuses on Renata and Renata alone. There are some other characters in this, but this is an exploration of one specific protagonist. And there are lots of stories like this, but they all rely on a strong protagonist concept and a strong protagonist execution, which I think that Emma Newman has pulled off here. Renata is a very non-standard protagonist. She is not the kind of hero that you read about in most stories, even though she's still palatable and still someone that you find interesting throughout the story. Planetfall is a character study. It has a really cool setting and the writing is good. But when you come into this story, understand that what you are getting into is an analysis of Renata that you will be performing as you read this book. So that's the end of all the things that I wanted to say without spoiling anything about Planetfall. If you have not read the book, go read it, and I will see you again after you read it, or never, or at the next book. Anyway, please leave. So, from here on out, spoilers. So I wanted to start with talking about the opening chapter, because the opening chapter defines your expectations, whether you are thinking about it or not. It talks about the kinds of themes that we're going to be exploring. It talks about who Renata is and what she thinks about on a regular basis. We learn about her job, and we learn about the situation in the colony, or the fact that she's in a colony right in the first chapter. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive of the first few pages. So the very first paragraph opens with Renata thinking in code. She has a little bit of pseudocode right in the narration. Now this never happens again, because it is only there to let you know right off the bat that Renata is a scientist, or rather she's an engineer. Renata is going to be a person who approaches things from an engineering perspective throughout the book. And honestly, I believe that this is a little bit of deception. This primes you to think that she is a person who thinks scientifically. When in reality, when you come back and look at this scene again after you've read the book, you think of Renata as a very emotional person. Because despite the fact that her job is to be an engineer, it affects not a whole lot of her psyche. She's not an extremely rational person, even though her thoughts are colored by the thought patterns that she has going about her job as the town's or the colony's 3D printer technician and engineer. In the specific memory with her mother, which is the first scene of the story, we learn quite a bit about Renata's thought process and desires at the time, even though we find out that this was at least 30 years ago, if not more. The Renata in this scene wants validation in general, but specifically from her mother in this scene. She has prepped the printer early so that her mom will be extra impressed by the progress that her printer has made by the time she comes in. She thinks about all the things that she did to try to make her mother be more impressed with her work before coming in here. And we know that her mom isn't in the colony, so when we translate this scene into what she wants in her current life, we think that she's a person who wants validation from everyone else around her, because that's who's present. We learn here that she runs the all-purpose 3D printers and that she loves her job. She has a lot of philosophical idealism about what her job is, and it's very justified in this universe. Renata does the majority of the work in this colony, as far as we can tell. She builds everybody's houses. She has helped everyone with all of their jobs relating to medicine and leadership. And so her love for 3D printing it's entirely justified, and I think it's the kind of thing that a lot of people would go for in that kind of universe. But an important component of that is that Renata came up with the science for the majority of what they are using. Every time they talk about a new development that the other colony doesn't have, it's something that Renata came up with. So Renata and her mother get into a conversation about whether or not it's right for Renata to be trying to save her father's life through 3D printing him some new organs. And it primes us with this idea of altruism versus selfishness. It's almost inconceivable to most readers that this woman would want her ex-husband to have the opportunity to survive. But this is a theme that the story is going to be exploring. It also seems like this idea of, should a person be allowed to receive 3D printed organs, is something that Renata's mother hasn't put any real thought into. She's seen a few headlines and she's thought about it for a few minutes, but she's making sweeping generalizations based on a gut feeling. So in here you have this flighty words versus real emotion theme that's coming up. And we'll talk about that later. And then we see Renata take this vase home with her from the Masher. And at this point, I thought that the reason Renata was at the Masher was because it's part of her job. She thinks about her job frequently while she is down there. She is looking at the things that are there from the perspective of a 3D printer engineer. She does say that she hopes nobody sees her while she's there, but there are any number of reasons that could be. So we see her take this vase home, and it says that the reason she's taking it is to remind me that there are still people creating for the love of it. And looking back at this decision to take the vase after having completed the book, you see just how thin her reasoning is. She has displayed this idealism throughout this conversation, but she doesn't display it very strongly again until very frequently in the rest of the book. It sets up an idea for who Renata is in the first chapter, but that idea is then broken down over the course of the novel. The first chapter builds in the reader this picture of an idealistic, hard-working 3D printer engineer who is doing everything for the people around her. But that person isn't the person Renata is now. But we don't know that. Finally, Renata stands up to her mother in this chapter. She tells her mother that she doesn't agree with her and that she stands up for herself and her 3D printing work, which is surprising given the attitude that we see from her as this kind of fragile person who is hiding from people in the present time. So it shows us that she believes in herself and believes in what she's doing. All of these things combined paint a picture of who Renata was back when she was on Earth. We have no idea that this isn't the person she is now. But by the end of the book, we are quite certain. Shortly after that, in chapter 2, Ren notes that she hates majority decisions because it makes it easy to make bad decisions. At first, I thought that this was a scientist's sense of superiority or a judgmental outlook on the rest of the colonists, but in hindsight it was foreshadowing. So I want to talk about how Renata changes in our eyes over the course of the book. So at the beginning of the book, we see her as an idealistic person who suffers from anxiety. I do want to bring up something. I have one major complaint for this entire book, and I'm not sure whether this should be a complaint, but I do want to bring it up. So I was listening to the audiobook when I first started reading this, and the audiobook is read by Emma Newman, and it starts out with an acknowledgement by Emma Newman, read by Emma Newman, where she's crediting the people who helped her. And in this, she talks about how this book is dedicated to her best friend who died, and how she suffers from anxiety herself. And the acknowledgement alone painted a very potent image of Emma Newman for me, largely because I could hear the emotion in her voice as she read it. And then 5 seconds later, we go directly into chapter 1. it was very difficult for me to separate the character that had just been built in my head by Emma Newman, of Emma Newman, from Renata, specifically because Renata also suffers from anxiety. And it got to the point where after about a chapter and a half, I decided to just read the book because I was unable to separate the two characters in my mind. Characters, of course, Renata from Emma Newman. But in hindsight, it did actually amplify the effect that Renata's anxiety had on me, the reader. I expected this to be a story, a cautionary tale about people with anxiety. Not a cautionary tale per se, but a story that tries to inform neurotypical people about what's going on in people with anxiety in their mind. I thought that it was going to be a story that is about how we should treat them and what kinds of assumptions that we should be making about them, and should we be placing responsibility on their shoulders that they can't handle. And for the majority of the book, I was expecting Emma Newman to make grand excuses for Renata by the end of the book. She didn't. So I'm not sure where to come down on that facet of the audiobook. So about Renata. So I want to discuss Renata in the context that she is a villain protagonist. Now that may sound a little bit harsh, and maybe it is, but I don't think so. My impression of her by the end of this is that she's a villain protagonist. And here's why. If you told this story from the perspective of anybody else in this entire story, she is the bad guy. In case you're watching this without reading the book and you just want me to tell you what happens, a major part of this story is Renata helping the leader of the colony create this religion for the colonists. So the colonists came here under the guidance of a woman named Sue, who was Renata's best friend. And Sue woke up from a coma and had a bunch of numbers in her mind, which, upon further investigation, were the coordinates to a planet. They all got on a colony ship, followed Sue there, and found this city that had been left behind by another civilization. Sue led a group of the more important colonists across the city, trying to find God, because Sue believed that God had told her to come to this planet. Sue came across this room with, they didn't know what at the time, that caused her to believe that God was dead, and she immediately killed herself. And this was on their first day on the planet. So Sue is dead, the colonists have no idea what to do, so Mac, the leader of the group, killed all of the other colonists who saw Sue's suicide, except for Renata, and created this myth that Sue was communing with God for the last 20 years by inducing a hallucination in one person from the colony every year. So once a year, someone from the colony will go eat this seed that causes them to believe that they are hearing a message from Sue, who is dead. And this person reports to the rest of the colony what the message from Sue was. It's something like, it's a platitude, something like, keep working hard, keep trying, I believe in the colony. And this is the colonists' religion. Because the people who came on this ship followed Sue here because Sue claimed that she was led by God, and she believed that she was. So the people in the colony believe that God and Sue are talking to whoever eats the seed because they have no reason to believe that they wouldn't. So Renata has been helping Mac to perpetuate this religion for the last 20 plus years, even though she knows that it's fake. And towards the end of the story, everybody finds out that it's the case, and surprise, surprise, they all hate Sue, and they arrest her and Mac. I'm sorry, they all hate Renata. Mac was an advertising genius back when they were on Earth, and he keeps control over the colony by deciding what the message is that goes to the colonists every year. He keeps up appearances by being the person that doubts the whole religion thing in public. So to the colonists, Renata is the person that helped Mac. Renata genetically engineered the seed that allows people to hallucinate the message from Mac that they believe is the message from Sue. The reason Sue went into a coma is because she inhaled the spores from this plant that implanted her with the coordinates, right? And the only person that knows about this plant, the only living person that knows about this plant, is Renata. So Mac could have never known about this plant if it wasn't for Renata. Mac kills everybody other than Renata who went on the expedition to explore God's city. And at some point, Renata must have told Mac, hey, here's this plant that causes hallucinations and can implant information in people's heads. Why don't we use this to create a religion? She is always thinking about how much less annoying things would be if people knew the truth. But we'll get to that later. Now, the other colonists who were supposedly killed, it turns out that they are alive and that their scheduled pod crash didn't actually go as planned. And to them, Renata is the enabler that allowed Mac to leave them to die. If Renata had spoken up after PLANETFALL, they could have gone and looked for the other pods. Now, I don't want to get into... I don't want to blame Renata for being a coward here. To Sue, Renata is the person who bastardized her memory and everything that she stood for. I'm sure that Sue would not want Renata to be doing what she is doing to the colonists and to her memory. And to Mac, she is the person who betrayed him. So, to anybody in the story, Renata is the bad guy. And in this story, Renata is also the bad guy to Renata. At the end of the story, the important colonists like Kay and other people who have the most valuable skills are kidnapped by the opposing colony and taken away. And Renata thinks about how she could try to go save them if this were a video game, but it would be very risky for her and she didn't think she could make it. And at that point, this was like 10 pages from the end of the book, I was just really, really frustrated with her. She just runs away, and that's the end of the book. She goes, you know what? I guess Sung Soo and the others can do whatever they want with those people, and I'm just going to leave. She doesn't think about them ever again. Or she doesn't think about being worried about them, or she doesn't think about maybe going after them in the morning. She doesn't think about maybe trying to go find some binoculars to scout and maybe coordinate anything with the other colonists. She doesn't think about trying to salvage any of the technology so that people can use it later. She just wants to run. Renata's father comments when she wants to leave the planet that she could save millions of people if she stayed on Earth and continued to develop the 3D printed organ technology that she's working on. And he says, if you leave, you will not be saving all the people who you could be saving. And she leaves anyway. And I think that space travel is an extremely important and worthwhile endeavor. And my immediate instinct is that Renata going off on this trip was the best thing to do because perpetuating space travel is vital to the survival of our race. But thematically, the book just told us Renata had the opportunity to save a whole lot of people, and instead she left. And at the end of the book, Renata had the opportunity to save a whole bunch of people, and instead she left. So I want to talk a little bit about Renata's mental illness. So we see basically two versions of Renata's mental illness. We see what she was like before she came to the colony, and we see what she's like in the present time and in the colony. And it is made very explicit to us that it's so much worse now in the present time. She does have anxiety about her mother seeing her work, but she still stands up for herself, and she still is proud of her work. And it appears that she's at least a little bit happy. Here on the colony, she's never truly happy about anything. But the reason she's like this is because she has been isolated. She lost absolutely everyone when she came here. She lost Sue, she lost her mom, she lost her dad, she lost her child, and she lost everyone that she ever knew on Earth. She notes that everyone she knows is probably dead. So, Renata is about 70 years old at the time of the story, and even though she expects that her and Kay's technology will allow them to develop longer lifespans, there's no indication that the same technology exists on Earth. So everybody that she knows is dead. But everybody that she knows that came with her to the colony, Sue, is also dead. A bunch of her friends were in the other colony, so they're dead too. And she has no opportunity to really make any other friends or develop socially because she has to keep these massive, massive secrets that are tearing her apart inside. She can never be close to Kay because she has to lie to Kay all the time. And that's the case for everybody else. Sung-soo at least pretends to really, really want to be her friend, but she can never let him in because she has so many secrets. She has to lie to him almost every time that she speaks anything to him. But the most important person that Renata lost when she came to this planet is herself. She lost her idealism, strong beliefs that she has in humanity and in goodness that we see in the first chapter are almost entirely gone in the rest of the book. Like the fact that she doesn't think democracy is a good idea because majority votes lead to bad decisions. She came here following Sue, the most important person to her in her entire life, but Sue is gone and so is Sue's son. Mac tells her what to do and she just does it. She doesn't really have any decision-making agency. She doesn't stand up to him, even though we saw her stand up to her mother in her flashback. She used to be a very strong Christian. In the first flashback, we see that she believes that God is helping her to develop this technology. And she thinks about maybe believing in God in the present time. So because she's lost all this control, she hangs on to what she can. Her home is a replacement for the self that she lost. She can surround herself with the items that will help her affirm the beliefs that she wants to have. She takes the vase that reminds her that people create things out of love because she doesn't create anything out of love anymore. But the other component is that she's isolated from the community. She can't connect to anyone, so the closest she can do is take their stuff. It's a one-sided connection. She can look at them, but they can't look at her. She can't be any of their friends. So if she's going to have anything close to it, this is the best compensation that she can get. Stealing their things. On top of that, Renata is a village elder. She was part of the first set of people to set foot on the planet. There's a new generation of children that have been born since they arrived. Renata is one of the oldest and most skilled people, so she doesn't have a lot of equals in the community. This severely restricts the number of connections that she can make. The reason it takes us so long to realize that Renata is not a great person is because everybody else in the story is pretty horrible. The first person we really meet is Mac, and one of the first things we find out about him is that he and Renata were for some reason responsible for killing the other colony. That's pretty bad. And Renata always thinks of him as lying in almost every sentence that he speaks. Sue, the person that Renata loved, lost her personality after waking up from the coma, something that Renata mourned deeply. She felt like their friendship was lost over the course of the journey because Sue was so consumed by this search for God. And then Sue left everyone else effectively to die by going into this room, realizing that they couldn't get what they came for, and then immediately committing suicide. Now, it seems like Sue wasn't in there anymore, but if she was, it's quite heartless to have abandoned the colony full of people that you led here. The townspeople in general are portrayed as shallow and careless and attracted to drama. They hold a lot of parties in the very short time span that we see over the course of this book. Nobody seems to be doing as much work as Renata, and they are extremely nosy when it comes to Renata's house. They don't listen to the doctors, they're heartless about her things, and they're excited at the prospect that something so dramatic as Renata being a hoarder has come out. And finally, there's Sung Soo. So I thought that Sung Soo was badly written, and this is a problem that I have sometimes. Sometimes I'll pick up on the fact that there's something weird about a character, and I'm like, this character is written poorly. No. Sung Soo is Sue's grandson, who is part of the other colony, and he acts as a refugee, comes into the story claiming that everybody else in his colony is dead and that he needs resources here in Renata's colony. And they give him a house, they welcome him to the community, they throw him like 3 parties because he's here now, and it turns out that he's actually just a scout for the other colony, which does indeed still exist, and there are plenty of them. The reason I thought that Sung Soo was poorly written is because he was just so enthusiastic about being Renata's dearest friend and solving all of her problems and hanging on her every word. He volunteers to be Renata's apprentice when she doesn't have... There's no one else in the colony who knows as much about 3D printing as she does by a very wide margin. The book portrays him as extremely kind and very excited to learn anything that Renata could teach him. Additionally, Renata has a weird attraction to him that I really should have seen as foreshadowing, but instead I just felt gross. I do think this is... I'm not going to complain about it, though. So, Renata is 70, or slightly less than 70, and Sung Soo is 22. And I was pretty disgusted with Renata, but I don't think that this was a bad writing choice. I think it was a great writing choice, because it subtly makes you go about Renata, which is the face that you make at the end of the book. So it turns out that the other people that were on the landing party that Mac tried to kill actually survived. They started their own colony and they all had kids, and they are extremely pissed at Renata and Mac for faking their deaths and in fact trying to kill them. So at the end of the story, they come in and they completely trash the main colony. They are setting fires and destroying printers. They are throwing the entire planet's population into back a few centuries as far as development goes. Without the 3D printers, they can't make more 3D printers for a very long time. And by the end of the story, you get the distinct sense that if Renata had done anything differently at any step, none of this would have happened. But you also get the sense that there was not a single decision that she made to be evil. First, she was afraid to confront Mac. Then she was more afraid to confront Mac. Then, over time, she made these 0.1% adjustments to her behavior. And that's the genius in this book. You are rooting for Renata the whole time. You want her to pull her shit together. You feel sympathy for her. You like her. And to some people, I'm sure this can come across as a gimmick. The hyper close first person that hides information about the narrator from you for as long as possible. I don't think this is a gimmick. I think that this is something that most books should do. The idea that you need to be inspecting the thought process of your narrator is one that I wish more books implemented. Because Renata is any other idealistic engineer who's really cares about space, plus a ton of pressure. And if books are supposed to allow us to look at ourselves and look at our own thought processes and behaviors and think about our values, then it's vital that they actually include studies of people's thought processes. Renata's narration is flawlessly delivered in that she never ever thinks of the trash in her home as trash. She always thinks of it as her stuff, even though she stole it from somebody else. She never thinks about the fact that her house smells, because why would she think about the fact that her house smells? You don't think about what your house smells like. Well, now you're thinking about it because I brought it up. This story can serve as a cautionary tale to anybody that has been asked to keep a secret, to anybody who tried to keep a secret and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. If Renata had even spilled the beans about the religion 10 years prior, things would have ended up differently, because they could have gone and found the other colony and extended help to them. Also, Renata never thinks about the fact that she was stealing resources from the colony and faking the resource levels so that she could continue stealing. And she thinks that it's things that people didn't want and therefore it's not stealing. And she's partially right. If somebody leaves their couch on the side of the road, then you're allowed to take it. But it's not her that has to go do the mining for the additional metal, which is what they're preparing to do at this point. She's taking things from the community and not giving them back. So at the end of the story, Renata goes back into God's City and goes to the room where Sue saw something that caused her to immediately kill herself. And that something is a humanoid member of a previous visitor species lying on a table. And it makes sense in context. But it basically indicates that somebody who lived on this planet sent out like a beacon to other planets, calling species to come here, where those species would come to this planet, start up a colony, and then somebody would lay down on that table and die. At the end of the story, Renata lays down on this table after the last specimen lying on the table disintegrates, and she dies and goes to heaven. And this is a really interesting choice. Now, it doesn't say that it's heaven, it's just, you're supposed to imply that. This is an interesting choice because I just went on this long, like approximately hour-long rant about how everybody in the story had their life personally ruined by Renata, and it is her fault. And everybody else has to stay on the burning planet while people are throwing bombs at each other, and she gets to go to heaven. Now, it's not the literal Christian heaven. Sort of. We don't really know what it's like. But it's this stage afterlife that people who are the representative of each species go to. Because she did make everybody miserable. She did bad things. She never thinks about Kay. She thinks about how Kay is very pretty and how she would like to have sex with Kay. But she never thinks about how she might be able to help Kay with Kay's personal problems. She never asks Kay how she's doing. We don't know what Kay's life is like, because Renata doesn't care about other human beings. At the same time, Renata is the person who enabled this entire mission. She stayed by Sue's bedside while Sue was in a coma, and she appears to have done 90% of the technological development required to keep this colony alive. Without without Renata, they would be not living in their really nice houses. They wouldn't be able to breathe the air as comfortably. They wouldn't be able to eat the things that they're eating. They wouldn't be able to print the things that they own. They wouldn't have as robust a recycling program. They wouldn't be able to have their approximately 15-hour work week that everybody appears to have. Renata did the most good for the colony also. So why shouldn't she be the person to represent humanity in Valhalla, or whatever it is? She's not even a devout Christian or member of their homebrew Christian religion that they do on this colony. She's the person that helped make it up. Anyway, so Renata's story is over, and there are more books in this series, but you don't have to read them. You can just stop right here, because Renata is dead. And you can imagine all kinds of horrible things that Sung Soo is doing to Kay and the other colonists who have been kidnapped. And I really appreciate that. You know, if you're just watching this video because you stumbled across this somehow and you haven't seen the other videos on my channel, the majority of the videos on this channel are dedicated to a 3,500 page book that I read over the course of 3 or 4 months. I am not opposed to pieces of literature being very, very long. But I am opposed to things being made longer for no reason. There's a current push in publishing to make trilogies. If you have enough material for 2 books, they will ask you to make it 3 books. Because 3 books is more books than 2 books. And trilogies sell well. So, even though the second book in a trilogy is almost always the worst, you keep it because trilogies are a formula that works well. And part of this is the sequel hook. At the end of a book that may have more books in the series, you have to leave things unresolved so that a person has to keep reading, because if it's resolved, they're not going to come back. No, that's not how it works, I think. A person is going to read the second book not because they want resolution, but because they were impressed by the first book and they are interested in reading more. If you leave details of your plot open with the explicit purpose of making it so the reader has to keep reading, it feels disrespectful. It feels like you're trying to brainwash your audience. That's not what I want to read. Now, do I want to know what happened after this? Yes. But Renata's story is over. And if there is another book that follows this up, I don't expect Renata to be in it. And I think that that is a real strength of this. Anyway, that's all I had to say on Planetfall. Hello, everybody. This is Jade again. I know, this is a little weird. I was going through the footage that I recorded for Planetfall to edit it, and I hated it. I realized that there were a lot of things that I portrayed in a way that didn't fully capture the essence of the book. And there are a lot of things that I'd like to blame on this, but the point is, I had some things that I'd like to add, because I feel like my portrayal of the book and Renata was extremely harsh. So first of all, I said that I thought that Sung Soo was written poorly. This was a bad way of phrasing what I meant. What I meant to say was, when I first started reading the book, I thought that Sung Soo's behavior was strange, and I thought that he was going to end up having been written poorly. But at the end of the book, understanding that he was a mole the entire time, the things that I was picking up that I thought were poor writing were actually just clues as to the fact that he is a mole. So no, it was good writing. I just misinterpreted it in the beginning because I was trying to figure out what was up with him. Second of all, I actually really liked Renata. 95% of the time in the book, I was quite endeared to her. Just as I was going through, I was noticing things that were negative about her that I felt like other readers might not notice. So I wrote it down in my notes, and then the end result was that the episode was very negative towards her. This was completely an accident. I don't think that Renata is an angel, but she's also not the devil. For one, I said that one of the reasons I didn't particularly care for Ren is that she doesn't care about anyone in the community. Now, this is still good writing. The reason she doesn't care about anyone in the community is because she has been isolated from everyone by all the lies that she's had to tell throughout the last 20 years. The lies that have been pushed on her by somebody else. So this is a quality in her that is unpleasant, but it is also not her fault. She's not a sociopath or anything. She just can't connect to anyone, and she has gotten out of the habit of doing so because she's been living a lie for multiple decades. I also called Ren a villain protagonist, and while I stand by the reasoning for why I said that, I don't think it was a very intelligent thing to say. I mentioned at the beginning of the story, or at the beginning of the video, that the world building in this is very different than most other sci-fi books that still strive for realism, because I feel like Emma Newman is trying to tell a story that doesn't fit the mold of most sci-fi. It is not a duplicate of any other book that you might find at Barnes & Noble. I am making a comparison between Renata and a villain protagonist because she does actually negatively impact the lives of the people around her, but she doesn't actually fit the mold of a villain protagonist. It's just a comparison. And in that, she's actually far closer to an anti-villain protagonist, but that's splitting hairs. If she were a villain protagonist, there would be a hero opposing her who's better than she is. But the person who opposes her throughout this book, most directly, is Sung Soo, who does things to the colony that are far worse than anything Renata ever did, namely that he lit it on fire. Renata is a much better person than he is, and a much better person than Mac is. Mac being the other actual villain of the story. The most important question of the story is whether Renata was at fault for the bad things that happened in the colony. And the answer overall is definitely no, not completely. She's not without blame, but it's not entirely her fault, and I feel like in the first section I kind of implied that, but that's really, it just isn't true. Mac is the person who is most at fault, and I accepted this immediately because it was abundantly clear, and then I didn't really make any notes about it. The most important element of this book that I ignored in the previous section is that Renata is a victim, and specifically she is Mac's victim, either by his apathy or by his design. At the same time, Mac's crimes of attempted murder and designing an entire fake religion for a colony eclipse the fact that he abused one person, because he was abusing everybody. However, narratively, it is more important to the story that is being told that Mac abused and took advantage of Renata. At the beginning of the story, chronologically, Mac offers Renata space in his box where that they are allowed to fill when they cross the galaxy, which endears Renata to him. And I don't think that he was being manipulative at that time. He just had extra space. And maybe he was being manipulative. He knew that Renata was a person that was trusted by Sue, and maybe he was thinking that later on he would be able to use this to his advantage, but it doesn't matter. This caused Renata to later tell the other members of the landing crew that they should trust Mac, and that is what allowed her to live when the others died. And that is what caused her to be the only one that knew that he was lying about the entire fake religion. And that is what caused her isolation. And ultimately, this led to the massive spike in problems related to her mental disorder. Do we blame somebody for inaction? This is one of the most important questions of the novel. And the blame in this is so absurdly complex. Even if you are only looking at what happens before Sung-soo arrives, Mac is the person who caused all of this, but Renata went along with it. But she has a mental issue. So what does that mean? And some of the other mistakes that she made, such as becoming a hoarder and taking resources from the colony, are a result of what Mac did to her on accident, but it was 30 steps down from something that Mac did. And this is a concept that was very difficult that ultimately I think Emma Newman pulled off. There was a cut and dry way to do this, where Renata is completely innocent at the end, or we see her as completely innocent at the end, even though she still participated. But Emma Newman didn't take that route. In fact, Emma Newman asks a whole lot of questions in this book, and even though they appear to not necessarily relate to our everyday lives, I can guarantee you that when we break down the questions into their individual components, at least one of them is something that you personally will experience or have experienced. So I wrote out a list of questions generated by the plot of this book, and this is in no way exhaustive, but just to demonstrate the kinds of ideas that are being floated. 1. Should a person be blamed for the bad things caused by their inactions? The most obvious. Renata doesn't tell people about certain things, and that causes problems. Should a person be blamed for the bad things or inaction caused by their mental disorder? Is it all right to fabricate a belief system in order to keep people in line? In the case of this colony, they all came here because they had a belief. And what would have happened if Mac had not told them that Sue was still alive? You would have had a lot of people who came here following Sue and now have no one to follow, no pathfinder to follow. And it would have caused mass hysteria and chaos. Is it unethical to lie to an entire colony of people, specifically by creating an entire religion? Of course. To what lengths should a leader go in order to keep a community intact? Was it Mac's responsibility to find a way to get the community to work together after Sue's death? Should a person be blamed for things that they're asked to do by their abuser? Do we blame Renata for things that Mac told her to do? Are lies okay if they keep people happy? If a community is excluded by the larger community who lives in relative decadence, is it acceptable for the smaller community to punish the larger community for their lifestyle? In the case of the smaller colony, the larger colony didn't even know they existed. But after 20 years of living in squalor, the smaller community hated the larger community. If someone dies, is it all right to lie about them after they are gone? If your religion turns out to come from aliens, does that invalidate the beliefs that you had before? If a person steals items from the trash, are they stealing or foraging? Does a community have the right to know if one of their members has a mental illness? Is Mac, who took advantage of Renata's mental illness, better or worse than Sung-soo, who acknowledged it and forgave her for that reason? But masterfully, Emma Newman doesn't answer any of these questions by the text. She patently refuses to. We can speculate that something bad would have happened if Mac didn't say anything to the colonists about Sue's death. But it's left ambiguous. It's left up to our imagination. It's a thought exercise. And all of these obviously are questions with no answers because they are They're philosophical questions. But Emma Newman doesn't claim any answer and doesn't try to convince you of anything, which I think is the mark of a fantastic author, because it causes you to continue to think about this way after the book is over. If this had been far more cut and dry, it would be a simpler story, and one that I may not even be talking about. Anyway, that is the real ending of this episode. See you at the next one.